Just so you know, this show is about scary stuff. So don't say I didn't warn you guys. And remember, don't be scared.
Episode 88. The Boys. War Baby here with another episode of Murderous Minors. Situated just an hour or so from beaches on the coastline of the Gulf of Mexico, Houston, Texas in the early 1970s was enjoying a boom, with suburbs cropping up all around it. There was plenty of work due to the petrochemical industry and the Houston Ship Channel, which connected the city to the open waters of the Gulf. Pushing further out from downtown became required as the population approached 2 million. However, the police force was unable to keep up, leading to alarming murder rates and cases that simply went unsolved. There just wasn't enough money, officers, or time. On this episode of Murderous Minors, we fall into the hole that was the Houston mass murders, discovered in 1973 when 17-year-old Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. murdered 33-year-old Dean Corll. This episode contains numerous mentions of rape, torture, and murder. May they rest in peace. North of downtown Houston sits its oldest suburb, the Heights, mostly lower to middle class back then, with businesses of all types cropping up all over due to lax zoning laws in the city. One such business was Corll Candy Company, started by a woman who wanted to compete with an ex-husband after they divorced and he kept their original business. In 1962, she and her kids moved to the Heights, and in 1965, she moved her factory to 22nd Street, across the road from Helms Elementary School. Her son, Dean Corll, was well-mannered and well-liked throughout town, and he was noticed due to his evident love of children. Wherever he was, young boys or teens were always with him. At the candy factory, he installed a pool table in the back and provided boys with candy to sell door to door, putting a little money in their pockets. Little boys like David Owen Brooks, who in about 1965 had wandered over to the factory after school with other kids. He was about 10 years old when he met Dean for the first time, according to his mother. Following his parents' split, he lived with his father in the Heights. Then he and his mother moved to Louisiana, where he began getting into trouble for stealing. Even when he lived in Louisiana, Brooks would visit his father, and since they didn't get along that well, he found himself spending more and more time at Dean Corll's 16th Street apartment. The man had closed the candy factory chapter of his life in 1968 when his mother moved to Colorado on the advice of a psychic. Once on his own, Corll's relationship with the neighborhood boys took a sinister and deviant turn behind closed doors of his ever-changing addresses. He next rented a place on Yorktown Street, about 5 miles south of Houston Heights, and began luring boys to his place to party or be sexually assaulted. One of his early abuse victims was a then 13-year-old David Brooks on visits to his father. The teen still preferred to be there than at his dad's house. 2 years later, in 1970, Brooks returned to live in Houston and with his father permanently. It was immediately evident that the normal generation gap issues that sometimes rear up in families were going to be an obstacle here. Like many parents and sons, they could not agree on an acceptable hair length. Unlike Dean Corll, young Brooks already had a criminal record and he'd been sent to live with his father to get him out of trouble in Louisiana. He quickly went to stay with relatives but saw Dean's apartment as home. The teen would continue to be constantly seen at Corll's side for the next few years, until he took off and got married at the age of 18. But Brooks had fit in well when he moved back since he had already lived there before. The 9th grader had a hearty, extended group of friends which included his buddy, 14-year-old Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. The pair didn't make it through the school year. David Brooks hung out with Dean Corll and many other neighborhood boys throughout 1970, and in December, he'd later say while being interviewed, a shocking incident occurred which ultimately led directly to Corll's murder. Brooks said that on December 13, 1970, he'd entered Dean's apartment on Yorktown unannounced and walked in on the man sexually assaulting two 14-year-old boys named Jimmy Glass and Danny Yates. Each boy was bound and all three were nude. Corll told Brooks later that what he had seen was related to his involvement in a homosexual pornography ring, but soon revealed that the boys had been murdered. He offered the teen $200 a head to bring him other boys to rape and kill, the more attractive the better. Instead of alerting the authorities or an adult that he trusted, 15-year-old David Brooks began to participate. The last time Jimmy and Danny were seen, they were walking away from a youth rally at the Evangelistic Temple Church. Police told these families that their boys were likely runaways, maybe hitchhiking to join a commune or become a hippie, which they all wanted to believe, only they didn't. The parents searched relentlessly, Jimmy's father consumed by guilt. As it turned out, Corll had already murdered 18-year-old University of Texas freshman Jeffrey Conan in that apartment in September of 1970. Corll continued moving around, landing 5 miles away at Place 1 Apartments on Magnum Road within weeks of killing Jimmy and Danny. On January 30th, 1971, Brooks helped Dean get brothers 13-year-old Jerry and 15-year-old Donald Waldrop back to his apartment after the pair had set off for the nearby bowling alley. Brooks would later claim that he watched the brothers be strangled but didn't participate in their killings, and would always maintain that he personally murdered no one. Their father was working at the site of a new apartment building being constructed next door. Years later, after having moved away, he would read an article highlighting that fact and be haunted knowing his sons had been missing, yet were so close to him. No connection was investigated between the 4 boys' disappearances, and although they happened within 6 weeks of each other, they were all classified as runaways. Brooks quit Waltrip High School around this time, and for his 16th birthday on February 12, 1971, Corll gifted him a green Chevy Corvette, because who would rat out a friend who'd buy you a Corvette for your very first car? Corll had made the teen an accomplice and was buying his silence for the sexual abuse and his knowledge of crimes committed. Corll knew exactly how to control the boys using money. He apparently paid $5 or $10 per sex act performed on him, and the fact that he'd already made them accomplices to criminal activity. Henley would later write in a confession, quote, "Me and David talked about killing Dean so that we could get away from this whole thing, and several times I have come to within an inch of killing him, but I just never got enough nerve to do it, because Dean told me that his organization would get me if I ever did anything to him." Soon after he turned 16, David Brooks began targeting his very own friends. On March 9, 1971, he persuaded his 15-year-old friend Randy Harvey to go back to Corll's to smoke pot and party. He went missing as he rode his bike home from work at a gas station, and he was sexually tortured and shot in the head. Brooks then helped bury his friend in the dirt of Stall 11 at Southwest Boat Storage in Houston. Corll had rented it in November of 1970, and roughly 3 years later, after being a polite and timely tenant, he questioned the owner about renting another, saying his was getting crowded. Jimmy and Danny and the Waldrop brothers were already buried there, while Corll's first known victim, Jeffrey Conan, was buried on the beach, just off the Winnie exit at High Island, Texas, roughly 80 miles from Houston Heights. 2.5 months after Randy went missing, his sister's boyfriend Gregory Maliwinkle was next to disappear. On May 29, 1971, the 16-year-old left his house with his 13-year-old friend David Hillegeist, and the pair were tortured, raped, and murdered in Corll's apartment and buried in the boat stall. Once David started luring boys over to Dean's, they also started routinely making their victims contact their families to try and convince them they were fine and that they'd be home soon. David Hillegeist had called his mother prior to his death and told her that he was an hour away in Freeport, Texas, swimming with friends. His mother informed police that she had heard from her son, and promptly, both Hillegeist and his friend Maliwinkle were removed from the Houston Police Department's list of missing people. This list's only purpose was to make it known that police knew these people were reported missing by their families, so if they were encountered, officers would question them about where they'd been. By policy, they did not look for these individuals whether they were children or not. Both of these boys knew Dean Corll and had for years. Maliwinkle and his mother both had worked for Corll Candy Company years before and considered Dean a decent guy. And it wasn't just David Hillegeist's family that was concerned for him, but one of his oldest friends frequently visited the missing boy's mother, whom he had known since his preschool days. 14-year-old Wayne Henley even took flyers bearing a $1,000 reward and hung them up all over Houston. But he was also slowly being brought into the circle, with Corll telling him at first that he could get rid of any stolen property Henley might come across. Then Brooks told Henley how he could make fast money, and Corll explained about his participation in the Dallas-based sex ring. The possibility exists that Brooks brought his friend to meet the Candyman to be his next victim, but instead of raping, torturing, and murdering Henley, he took a liking to him. Perhaps the fact that he knew that Mrs. Henley always knew exactly who her son was with made Corll feel as though he wouldn't be an optimal target. Henley went on to tell author Skip Hollandsworth, quote, "Maybe Dean was considering me as one of his victims, but we hit it off. He was a smart, clean-cut, nicely dressed man. He listened to me. He explained things to me. He was kind." Henley felt that he was, quote, "more of a brother-type person, somebody I could talk to. I admired Dean because he had a steady job. In the beginning, he seemed quiet and in the background, and that made me curious. I wanted to find out what his deal was. The fact that he did work, wasn't a wild drunk, got along with kids and people in general, that's what started it." That kind man, however, murdered 17-year-old Reuben Watson on August 17, 1971, after Brooks convinced him to come party at the apartment. When he was forced to call his mother later, he told her that he would see her that night at 7:30, and that he was with his friend David Brooks, who later helped to bury him in the boat stall. On February 9, 1972, 17-year-old Willard Rusty Branch went over to Corll's new apartment on Schuler Street for a party, and never returned home. He had been castrated and shot, and his severed genitals found in a Ziploc bag, buried next to him in the boat stall in 1985. His father, a Houston Police Department radio technician, suffered a fatal heart attack while searching for his son. Months after he had turned down Brooks and Corll's initial offers, the Henley family needed money. Even though Wayne had dropped out of high school to work and had been helping support his family since he was 11 years old. Elmer Henley Sr. had since moved on. About his father, Jr. would later say in a James Conaway article for Texas